He built an empire on debts collected and promises kept, until a car bomb took his legs and left him ruling from a chair he refused to be seen in. 12 nurses walked through his gates in 6 months. 12 nurses walked back out. Then came Mary Burris, broke, running 20 minutes late, and loud enough to fill a house that had gone quiet with fear. She broke his favorite decanter within the first minute. She was also the first person in 6 months who looked at him and didn't flinch. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. The Corolla gave out on the gravel drive, 40 feet short of the gate, the engine coughing itself into silence like it had been waiting for an excuse. Mary sat there a second, hands still on the wheel, and told herself this was fine. It was not fine. $40 in her account, an eviction notice creased into her glove box, and a callback from a number with no name, triple pay, private care, discretion expected. She hadn't asked what kind of man paid that much to keep a nurse quiet. She got out anyway, tote bag digging into her shoulder, boots crunching too loud on gravel that clearly wasn't used to being disturbed. 2 men in black suits stood at the gate, watching her the way people watch something they expect to fail. "I'm here for the caregiving job," she said, chin up. "If either of you is what I'm walking into, tell me now and save us the trouble." Neither answered. The gate opened anyway. The house swallowed sound the way old money always does. Thick rugs, cold air, a hallway that smelled like cedar and something older. The study door stood open. Dustin Garza sat with his back to her, wheelchair angled toward the window, a glass of whiskey balanced in a hand that no longer fully obeyed him. "You're late," he said, without turning. "Car died at your gate. Miss me?" He turned then, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood. Broad-shouldered, tattoos climbing both forearms, a face that had clearly stopped apologizing for anything a long time ago. He looked at her like she was a bill he had no intention of paying. Mary didn't apologize for him, didn't rush to sweep up the glass. She stepped over it instead, crouched down, and pulled the blanket off his lap before he could stop her. His hand caught her wrist, hard, fast, an old reflex that had nothing to do with her. She didn't pull away. She just waited, and after a moment his grip loosened, surprised at itself. What she found under the blanket told her everything the house's cold rooms and closed doors had been covering for, muscle gone soft with neglect, skin that hadn't been checked properly in weeks. "If I'm taking this job," she said, "I need to see what I'm actually dealing with. Not whatever you've been hiding under a blanket in a room set to 68 degrees. Something in his face gave way, not softness, exactly, but the particular shock of being seen without being pitted for it. 6 months of nurses had either flinched or performed sympathy he could smell coming from the hallway. Mary did neither. "You're hired," he said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to. She didn't know yet that there was already a folder in his desk with her name on it, her history, her brother's debts, assembled 2 weeks before she'd ever driven up that road. She thought she'd just talked her way into a job. She had no idea she'd walked into something that had already chosen her. The Corolla gave out on the gravel drive, 40 feet short of the gate, the engine coughing itself into silence like it had been waiting all morning for an excuse. Mary sat there for a second, both hands still on the wheel, listening to the tick of a dying radiator and telling herself this was fine. It was not fine. She had $40 in her checking account, an eviction notice folded into quarters in the glove box, and a nursing license that had bought her exactly 1 callback in 6 weeks, this one from a number with no name attached, offering triple the going rate for private care, discretion required. Nobody paid that kind of money for something easy. She'd learned that a long time ago, usually the hard way, usually right before her rent came due. She popped the hood anyway, out of habit more than hope, and stared at an engine that had clearly given up somewhere around Ohio. Steam curled off the block. Somewhere behind her, gravel crunched under boots that weren't hers. "You can't park there." She hadn't heard him walk up, a broad man in a suit that fit too well for the middle of nowhere, hand resting near his hip in a way that wasn't casual at all. Another one stood a few yards back near a set of iron gates that looked like they'd been forged for a different century, wrought black against a wall of 200-year-old oaks that had probably never heard a Honda die on their doorstep before. "Believe me," Mary said, straightening up and wiping her hands on her scrubs, "if I could move it, I would. It's not exactly parked. It's more like it surrendered." She slammed the hood shut with more force than necessary, mostly for effect. "I'm here about the nursing position. Private care, off Sheridan Road. If either of you is the one I'm supposed to be examining, I'd like to get started because I've got a feeling this interview is going to be a long one." Neither man smiled. One of them murmured something into a radio clipped at his collar, low enough that she couldn't catch it, and for a long 10 seconds, nobody moved. Mary stood there with her tote bag digging into her shoulder, stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, a folder of references nobody had bothered calling, and refused to let her face show how much she needed this to work out. The gate opened. She walked the drive alone, because apparently that was part of the arrangement, gravel crunching under boots that suddenly sounded far too loud in all that quiet. The estate rose up ahead of her slow, the way something does when it wants to be noticed. Limestone and dark wood, ivy trained too neatly up one wing, windows tall enough to make her feel like she was walking into a museum rather than a job interview. She thought about turning around. She thought about the eviction notice and her glove box instead, and kept walking. Inside, the air changed before her eyes did. Cool, still, faintly like cedar and old cigars, the kind of silence that had money behind it. A man in a dark suit met her in the foyer, said nothing beyond "this way," and led her down a hall lined with portraits of people who all looked like they disapproved of her shoes. The study door was already open. A man sat with his back to her, wheelchair angled toward the window, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in one hand. "You're late," he said, without turning around. "Car died at your gate," Mary said. "Actually, technically, it died on your gravel. I'd call that punctual, given the circumstances." He turned the chair then, slow, and looked at her the way a man looks at an expense he hadn't budgeted for. Dustin Garza was younger than she expected and harder looking than any photo could have prepared her for, broad through the shoulders, forearms sleeved in ink that climbed up past his collar, a jaw set like he'd trained it that way on purpose. His eyes went over her once, unimpressed, and his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, gave the faintest tremor before the glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. Mary set her bag down, walked past the two nearest shards without looking at them, and crouched by the glass anyway, not to apologize for him, but because leaving it there was a hazard, and old habits from a decade of hospital floors didn't just switch off because the room had a chandelier in it. "You'll want somebody dealing with that rug," she said, nodding at the wet patch spreading near his wheels. "Wet floor, slick rug, somebody's hip breaks, and then you've got two of us to deal with instead of one." Before he could answer, she reached out and pulled the blanket off his lap. His hand shot out and caught her wrist, hard, fast, an old reflex that clearly answered to something other than politeness. She didn't pull back. She just held still and looked at him until, after a beat too long, his grip loosened on its own, like it had surprised him more than her. What she found underneath told her everything the cold room and the closed blinds had been hiding. Wasted muscle. Skin that hadn't been properly checked in longer than anyone should let go. A body that had been managed, not cared for. "If I'm taking this job," she said, not unkindly, "I need to see what I'm actually working with. Not whatever's been buried under a blanket in a room set to 68 degrees like you're preserving a corpse." Something shifted behind his eyes, not offense, something closer to shock at being looked at directly for once, without flinching and without pity dressed up as kindness. "You're hired," he said, and it came out rougher than he seemed to intend. Mary didn't know yet that a file with her name on it already sat 2 drawers away, assembled weeks before she'd ever driven up that road. She only knew she'd walked in broke and was walking out employed, and for the first time in a month, that felt like enough to build on. The weeks that followed found a rhythm neither of them admitted to enjoying. Mary showed up at 7, argued with him about his blood pressure medication by 7:15, and by the second week had rearranged his study, without asking, on the grounds that a man who couldn't stand shouldn't have to reach across a desk for anything. Dustin complained about all of it and changed none of it back. Then came the storm. It rolled in off the lake sometime after midnight, the kind that rattled the old windows in their frames and turned the oaks outside into black shapes lurching against the glass. Mary had stayed later than usual, a bad night, his blood pressure spiking for no reason she could pin down, and she'd fallen asleep in the armchair by his bed rather than drive home in it. She wasn't sure what woke her first, the thunder or the sound of him. His body was seizing in on itself, muscles locking without his permission, a groan tearing out of him that had nothing performative in it at all. She was up before she was fully awake, crossing the room in the dark, climbing onto the bed to hold his legs still with her own weight while his hands fisted in the sheets. "Stop fighting it," she said, low and steady, the voice she used for exactly this. "Breathe, Dustin. I'm right here." It passed the way these things did, all at once, then slow, leaving him hollowed out and staring at the ceiling like it had personally wronged him. She got him water. She got him steadier. And for the first time, lying there in the dark with the storm still going outside, he told her about the parking garage. 2 pounds of C4 wired under a car that hadn't even been his. The sound before he understood what the sound meant. "I thought I was dead," he said. "Now I just don't want anyone to see me like this." She didn't say anything comforting, because she'd learned by then that comfort wasn't what he wanted. She just sat with it, and after a while, got up to get his medication. That was when her fingers caught on something behind the pill bottles, a folder, wedged into the back of the drawer's lock broken and never fixed. One more small thing a man who trusted no one had never gotten around to repairing. She almost left it. She told herself later that she almost left it. She opened it instead. Photographs first, herself, unaware, handing cash to her brother outside a bar in a neighborhood she didn't love being reminded of. Bank statements that weren't hers to have been pulled. Notes in a clipped, careful hand that she recognized immediately as his, even though she'd never seen him write more than a signature. Her brother's name. His debts. A number that had, at some point recently, gone quietly to 0. At the bottom, underlined once. Loyalty despite chaos. Exactly what I need. Her hands went cold before the rest of her caught up. He'd known. Not guessed, not suspected, known, in detail, with photographs, before she'd ever driven up that gravel drive and broken his glass. And somewhere in the middle of that, he'd paid off her brother's debt like it was a line item and never said a word. "Close the drawer, Mary." His voice came from the bed, quiet, no storm left in it now. "That's my business." She turned, folder still in her hand. "It's got my name on it. That makes it a little bit mine too. I looked into everyone I hire. It's not personal." "Everything in this folder is personal," she said. "My brother's not personal to you. He's personal to me. And you just decided, without asking, to hand over money like it was nothing, and then filed the receipt next to my medical history." He didn't flinch away from that the way she expected him to. "Would you have taken the job if I'd told you up front? Or would you have walked straight back to that dead car and driven off in your head, even if your legs couldn't follow?" She didn't have a fast answer for that, which annoyed her more than the folder had. Growing up covering for a brother who kept making the same mistake had taught her to separate a man's control issues from his character. She'd had to, or she'd have walked away from her whole family years before. She wasn't excusing what Dustin had done. She was doing the harder thing, which was deciding, in real time, whether the man who'd investigated her like a liability was the same man who'd let her see the wreckage under his blanket without flinching. Some part of her already suspected those two men couldn't be pulled apart. "I don't love being a file in somebody's desk," she said finally, closing it and setting it down harder than she needed to. "But I'll let it go. For now." "For now," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it. "Don't get used to it." He almost smiled at that. She caught the ghost of it before he could smother it, gone as fast as it came, the way most true things were with him. She left the folder on the desk instead of putting it back in the drawer, a small, deliberate refusal to pretend she hadn't seen it. He didn't ask her to hide it either. That, more than anything he'd said all night, told her something had shifted between them. Quietly, without either of them agreeing to it out loud, the way most real things did in that house. The meeting had been called for 10, at a restaurant on a street Mary didn't recognize, blinds down in the middle of the day like the place had something to hide from the sun. She hadn't been told why she needed to come. Dustin had simply said, the night before, that it would look better if she did, and hadn't explained what better meant, and she hadn't liked that answer enough to let it go without a fight she ultimately lost. The dining room had been cleared for them. White tablecloths, empty chairs stacked against one wall, a long table down the center where a dozen men in dark suits sat with the particular stillness of people who'd learned early that talking too much got you noticed for the wrong reasons. Dustin sat at the head, chair angled just enough that the wheels weren't the first thing anyone saw when they walked in. Mary stood behind him, medical bag on her shoulder, feeling like a prop in a play nobody had given her the script for. Rocco Faldano sat 2 seats down on the right, heavy through the shoulders, a scar cutting one cheek in a line too straight to have come from anything but a knife. He had the look of a man doing math he shouldn't have been doing, the kind that always ended in somebody else losing. The talk started ordinary enough: shipments, a delay at a warehouse, a name Mary didn't recognize who'd apparently stopped paying on time. She stopped listening properly somewhere around the second grievance, until Rocco's voice changed register, pitched just loud enough to carry to the far end of the table. A man who can't stand, he said, not looking at Dustin directly, looking instead at the men around him, gauging who'd nod, isn't a man who can lead. No disrespect. It's just math. The room didn't go quiet exactly. It went careful, the particular hush of men deciding whether to laugh or wait and see who else laughed first. Dustin's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed flat on the table, steady, giving nothing away. Mary had spent enough weeks with him now to know that stillness cost him more than shouting would have. She stepped forward before she'd fully decided to. "Are you a doctor?" she said, loud enough that it landed in the corners of the room. Rocco turned, surprised enough that his mouth opened before his brain caught up. "A neurologist, maybe? Because unless you've got a medical degree hiding under that suit, I'd think twice about diagnosing Mr. Garza's leadership from across a dinner table." A couple of the men near the far end exchanged a look. Someone near the back made a sound that could have been a cough and could have been a laugh swallowed halfway. "This isn't a nurse's conversation," Rocco said, recovering, voice gone flat. "Funny, because it sounds like a medical one. You want to talk about what he can and can't do with his body, that's my department, not yours." She let that sit half a second before she kept going. "He survived 2 pounds of C4 wired under a car that wasn't his. He runs this whole operation from the neck up, which, respectfully, is more than I can say for whatever's happening at your end of the table right now." The silence that followed had a different weight to it than the one before. Rocco's face went through something complicated. Anger first, fast, then something more careful underneath it, recalculating. He wasn't looking at Mary like a nuisance anymore. He was looking at her like a variable he hadn't accounted for. Dustin's hand came up and settled on her shoulder, brief, deliberate, the kind of gesture that meant more in that room than a speech would have. It wasn't affection on display. It was a message, sent plainly to everyone at that table. "She belongs to my side of this, and you'll treat her accordingly." "We done here?" Dustin said, voice even, eyes on Rocco the whole time. Rocco didn't answer right away. He leaned back instead, folded his hands, and gave Mary a long look that she didn't much care for. Not quite respect, not quite threat, something balanced uneasily between the two. "Didn't realize you'd hired a bodyguard along with a nurse," he said finally. "I contain multitudes," Mary said, and didn't smile when she said it. The meeting wound down after that, business finishing in clipped, careful sentences, men filing out in 2s and 3s without meeting anyone's eyes too long. Mary didn't relax until they were back in the car, the privacy glass up, rain starting against the windshield in the first fat drops of what would become a real storm later. "You didn't have to do that," Dustin said, watching the street go by rather than her. "I know. He's not a man you want paying attention to you." "He was already paying attention to you," she said. "I just redirected some of it." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its usual flat control. "That's exactly what worries me." She didn't have an answer for that yet, not one she trusted, so she reached over instead and straightened his collar, the same habitual gesture she'd started doing without noticing when it began. Outside, across the room they'd just left, one of the household staff glanced down at a phone under the table and typed something short before slipping it back into his pocket, a small motion neither of them saw, already setting something in place that hadn't announced itself yet. Dustin wore charcoal that night, the good suit, the one he saved for occasions he pretended not to care about. He told her it was business, a dinner with two men from Milwaukee who wanted assurances about a shipment route, but he'd also had Marcus pick a restaurant with white tablecloths and candlelight instead of one of the backroom places they usually used, and Mary had noticed that without saying anything about it. "You don't have to come tonight," he said in the car, watching her fingers work a wrinkle out of his lapel rather than watching her face. "It'll bore you. Men talking about trucks." "You said that about the accountant meeting," she said. "Turned out you're funding a scholarship for kids in Bridgeport under a name nobody's supposed to trace back to you." She smoothed the fabric flat and finally met his eyes. "You're not as boring as you'd like people to think, Mr. Garza." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, gone before she could call it one. He didn't answer. He never did, when she got too close to something he hadn't decided to say out loud yet. The restaurant sat on Fifth, a narrow storefront with brick walls and low light, the kind of place that looked like nothing from outside on purpose. Security had swept the block an hour earlier. Mary had watched two of Dustin's men do a slow circuit of the street before they'd even pulled up, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that this had become normal to her. They'd barely made it through the appetizers when it happened. The front window went first, not one shot, but a ragged volley, glass detonating outward in a bright sheet that caught the streetlight for half a second before it hit the pavement in 1,000 pieces. Somewhere behind her a woman was screaming and didn't stop. The air filled with the smell of cordite and scorched wood, thick enough to taste. Dustin was thrown from his chair in the first second of it, pinned between an overturned table and the floor, one hand scrabbling for a grip his legs couldn't give him, cheek pressed to cold tile. Mary didn't think. She didn't remember deciding to move. 1 second she was still in her chair, the next she was on the floor, 15 feet of open, bullet-torn space between her and him, the world gone narrow and roaring, her own heartbeat louder in her ears than the second round of gunfire cracking somewhere behind her. She slid the last few feet on her knees, felt them tear open against the tile, and got her body between him and the window without any clear thought behind it beyond get there, get there. Get there. "Mary, get down." His voice cracked with something she hadn't heard from him before. Not command, fear, real and unguarded. She didn't listen. A piece of shrapnel from the overturned chair caught his shoulder, and even pinned, even with half his body refusing to answer him, he twisted beneath her, using what strength he had left in his torso to angle himself between her and the open street. "Are you insane?" he shouted, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. "Shut up and hold still," she shouted back, and the absurdity of it, bickering like an old married couple in the middle of a firefight, was the only thing keeping either of them from coming apart completely. Marcus got them out through the kitchen, past a walk-in cooler and a service door that slammed shut on its hinges behind them, out into an alley where a second car was already idling, engine running before they'd even cleared the doorway. They ended up 20 minutes later in a warehouse Mary hadn't known existed, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in a way that made everything look bruised. The adrenaline drained out of both of them in long, shaking waves that arrived well after the danger had passed. Mary stitched his shoulder with hands that trembled but didn't stop, breath coming in short, counted intervals, 4 in, 4 out, a trick from an ICU years back for keeping her own hands honest when the rest of her wanted to fall apart. Dustin watched her work under the buzzing light, jaw tight against the pain, and said nothing for a long time. "You're a liability," he said finally, quiet, not looking at her. "Your legs are dead," she answered, not looking up from the needle. "But you still covered me with your own body when you could barely move below the waist.
So no.
You're still the strongest man I've ever met." His hand found hers where it rested against his shoulder, not to stop her, just to feel that she was real, that they'd both actually made it out of that street. Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. Something had shifted in the 15 feet of open floor between his overturned chair and her knees hitting tile, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was ready yet to give it a name. The stitches were done. Mary had tied off the last one 20 minutes ago and still hadn't moved from the low stool she'd pulled up beside him, gauze and tape scattered across a folding table that had clearly seen worse things than a bullet wound before tonight. The warehouse had gone quiet around them. Marcus posted somewhere near the front. The rest of the men dispersed to check the block, leaving just the buzz of the fluorescent light, and the two of them, and the particular silence that comes after fear, has burned itself out and left something else standing in its place. "You should eat something," she said, mostly because the silence had gone on long enough that she needed to fill it with something practical. Low blood sugar makes shock worse. "I don't want to eat something." He was watching her hands, still faintly unsteady from the adrenaline, rather than her face. "I want to know why you didn't listen to me. When I told you to get down, you heard me, you looked right at me, and you didn't listen." Mary set the roll of gauze down and finally met his eyes. "You want me to apologize for not leaving you on the floor? I want you to understand that if that shrapnel had been 6 inches to the left, you'd be dead, and it would have been because you decided my life was worth more than yours in a split second, without asking me, without giving me any say in it. You did the same thing," she said. "You used what was left of your body to get between me and the street. Don't act like that was some noble exception, and what I did was reckless. It's different."
"Why?"
"Because you're allowed to throw yourself into danger for someone, and I'm not." He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice had lost the edge it started with. "Because I've spent 8 months telling myself it doesn't matter what happens to me anymore. That's easy to believe when there's nobody standing close enough to get hurt because of it. You make that a lie every time you get close." The room went very still. Mary felt something in her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the way he'd said it, flat, unguarded, like it had cost him something to admit out loud. "I didn't ask to be the thing that makes your math complicated," she said, quieter now. "I know you didn't. That's what makes it worse." He looked away from her then, jaw working, and for a second she thought that was going to be the end of it. Another door, he'd open a crack, and then shut before she could see through it properly. "I told myself hiring you was practical. Triple pay, discretion, someone who wouldn't scare off in a week like the others. I told myself that for 2 months, and it stopped being true somewhere around the night of the storm, and I've been pretending not to notice ever since." What stopped being true? That this was practical. His eyes came back to hers, steadier now than she'd ever seen them. "You're not just after me, Mary. I don't know when that stopped being true. I just know it isn't anymore, and I don't know what to do with that because everyone I've ever let matter to me has ended up a liability, a target, or a casualty, and I don't know how to want you close without also wanting to send you as far from me as possible." Mary sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere she hadn't expected. "You've got a real talent for making affection sound like a threat assessment. It's not far off most days. I noticed you're funding a scholarship you don't take credit for. I noticed you looked into every detail of my life and then quietly fixed the worst part of it instead of holding it over me. I noticed you covered me tonight with a body that could barely move below the waist because your first instinct under gunfire was still to protect someone else before yourself." She reached out and took his hand, the one not currently bandaged, and held it steady the way she'd have held it during a procedure, except this wasn't that. "I don't think you're as dangerous to be close to as you think you are. I think you're just out of practice at letting anyone try." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful blankness he wore in front of his men, not the flash of temper she'd learned to read past. Just him, tired and bloodied and honest in a way the last 8 months apparently hadn't allowed. "I don't know how to do this," he said low. "Neither do I," she said. "I've spent my whole life keeping people at exactly the distance where they can't disappoint me. You're the first person I've wanted close enough to risk it." He reached up, slow, giving her every chance to move away, and she didn't. His hand found the side of her face, rough palm against her jaw, and when he kissed her it wasn't careful the way she might have expected from a man who measured every move. It was certain, like something he'd stopped arguing himself out of. She kissed him back with the same steadiness she'd used on his wound 20 minutes before, hands and mouth both finally doing something that had nothing to do with survival for the first time all night. When they broke apart, he kept his forehead against hers, breathing like the gunfire had shaken loose something he'd been holding shut for a very long time. "That complicates things," he said. "Good," Mary said. "You needed complicating." He waited 3 days before he brought it up, which Mary would later understand was about as long as Dustin Garza was capable of sitting on a decision once he'd made it. She found the envelope on the kitchen counter Tuesday morning, thick, unmarked, sitting next to her coffee like it belonged there. "What's this?" "Open it." She did, and went very still. Cash, more of it than she'd seen in one place in her life, and underneath it, a folded printout, a flight itinerary, a name that wasn't hers stamped across the top, a departure out of O'Hare that evening. "You're sending me to California," she said, not a question. "Sacramento. Marcus has a cousin out there, a clinic that's hiring. Good pay, clean records, nobody who'll ever connect you to any of this." Dustin sat across the counter from her, hands folded, using the same flat, careful voice he used with the men at that table on Taylor Street, the voice that meant he'd rehearsed this. "The money's enough to get you set up. New apartment, a few months of breathing room. You won't need me for any of it. That's not what this is about, and you know it." "It's exactly what this is about. Rocco knows your face now. He knows you matter to me, which makes you a lever he can pull, and I am not going to sit in this chair and watch someone use you against me because I was selfish enough to let you stay close." His jaw was tight, the same tightness she'd learned meant he was holding something back by force. "I've buried people who mattered less to me than you do. I'm not doing it again." Mary picked up the envelope and looked at it for a long moment, feeling something cold settle where 3 nights ago there'd been nothing but warmth and his hand against her jaw. "So this is the part where you decide for both of us," she said. "Again. This isn't the folder, Mary. It's exactly the folder. You did the math on my life without asking me, decided what was best, and now you're handing me a plane ticket like it's a kindness instead of you being a coward about what actually scares you." Her voice had gone sharp, and she let it. "You're not protecting me. You're protecting yourself from having to watch what happens if staying goes wrong. That's not fair. Isn't it?" She stood, chair scraping back hard against the floor. "You held me under gunfire 3 nights ago with a body that could barely move. You kissed me like you'd stopped arguing with yourself about it. And now, the second things get complicated in a different direction, you want to buy me a one-way ticket and call it generosity." He didn't answer right away, and the silence between them had teeth in it, the kind that came from 2 people both refusing to be the first to look away. "I grew up watching my mother stay with a man who kept telling her it was for her own good every time he pushed her further away," Mary said, quieter now but no softer. "I promised myself a long time ago I'd never let anyone make that decision for me again, no matter how good their reasons sounded. So no, I'm not taking the money, and I'm not getting on that plane. Rocco isn't a man you argue your way past, Mary. This isn't a boardroom. People die. I know that. I watched a restaurant get shot to pieces around us, remember? I stitched your shoulder with my own hands. I'm not naive about what this is." She picked up the envelope and, before he could say anything else, dropped it back on the counter in front of him, cash and itinerary both, hard enough that a few bills slid loose across the granite. "But I don't run from things because they're dangerous. I run from things when they're not worth staying for. This is worth staying for. You don't get to decide that's not true just because it scares you more than a bullet does." Dustin looked at the money scattered between them, then back at her, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like defeat, except it wasn't. It was closer to relief he didn't want to admit to. "I can't protect you from all of it," he said finally, voice rough. "I need you to understand that. If you stay, there will be more nights like the one at the restaurant, maybe worse." "I don't need you to protect me from all of it," Mary said. "I need you to stop trying to protect me by pushing me away. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel the same to you." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her the way he had that first day, except nothing about it was unimpressed anymore. "Everyone I've ever loved, I've lost by keeping too close or losing by pushing away. I don't actually know how to do this any other way." Then let me help you learn a third way, she said and reached across the counter, closing her hand over his. Starting now. Starting with you putting that money back wherever it came from, because I'm not for sale, and I'm not going anywhere. He turned his hand over under hers, lacing their fingers together, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else. The cash sat forgotten between them on the counter, and outside, the estate held its usual careful silence, unaware yet of how much had just been decided inside it. The alarm didn't sound like Mary expected an alarm to sound. It was quiet, almost polite, a soft repeating chime from the panel by the bedroom door, and it took her 3 full seconds of blinking in the dark to understand what it meant. Dustin. She was already moving, already reaching for him. I hear it. His voice had none of the grogginess hers had. He was awake, alert, reaching for the chair beside the bed with the kind of speed that told her he'd been half expecting this for longer than he'd let on. Perimeter breach. East fence. The house came alive around them in the next 30 seconds, not shouting, nothing so loud, just the low, practiced movement of men who'd trained for exactly this. Marcus's voice crackled through on a radio somewhere down the hall, clipped and fast. Mary got Dustin into the chair, grabbed the bag she'd started keeping packed by the door without ever admitting to herself why, and followed him out into the corridor. Study, he said.
Now.
Why the study? Because it's the only room in this house with a door that locks from the inside and walls thick enough to stop around. He was already wheeling fast down the hall, and she matched his pace, heart hammering in a way that felt horribly familiar now, an echo of the restaurant 3 weeks back. They didn't make it. The first shot came from the stairwell, splintering the doorframe a foot from Mary's head, and she dropped instinctively, pulling Dustin's chair sideways into the cover of a hallway console table that had clearly never been meant to stop a bullet, but did its best anyway. 2 men in dark clothes came around the corner at the top of the stairs, and for 1 frozen second nobody moved. Dustin moved first. His hand came up from beneath the chair's armrest with a gun she hadn't known was holstered there, and he fired twice. Fast, controlled, the kind of shooting that came from someone who'd done this before and hated that he had to again. 1 man went down. The other ducked back around the corner, and in the half-second of quiet that followed, Mary heard glass breaking somewhere below them and a second set of footsteps, closer, coming up the back stairs. Behind you, she said, and grabbed the only thing in reach, a heavy iron candlestick off the console table, as a 3rd man came through the service door at the end of the hall, gun already raised. She didn't think. She swung it hard into his wrist as the shot fired wide, the round burying itself in the ceiling in a shower of plaster, and followed through with her shoulder into his chest before he could recover, both of them going down in a tangle on the hardwood. He was bigger than her, stronger, and for a few brutal seconds it was only her weight and her elbow and a fury she didn't know she had access to keeping his hands away from the gun that had skidded loose across the floor. Dustin's second shot ended it, fired past her shoulder with a precision that made her flinch even knowing it wasn't aimed at her. Get up, he said, breathing hard, already turning the chair toward the stairwell where the last of the noise had gone quiet in a way that felt worse than the gunfire had. That's not all of them. They found Rocco in the study. Of course it was the study, Mary thought later. Of course he'd go straight for the room Dustin ran his empire from, standing over the wrecked lock of the desk drawer, 2 more men flanking him, all 3 turning at once when the door swung open. Should have taken the money and the plane ticket, Rocco said, and there was something almost sad in it, underneath the contempt. Would have been cleaner. Nothing about you has ever been clean, Rocco, Dustin said, and fired before Rocco's men could raise their weapons. It went fast after that, faster than Mary's mind could properly track. One of Rocco's men going down under Dustin's second shot, the other lunging for Mary and catching a candlestick to the temple that put him on the floor for good. Rocco himself made it 2 steps toward the window before Dustin's wheelchair, driven forward with a speed and force that shouldn't have been possible, slammed into him hard enough to pin him against the wall, 1 massive forearm across his throat, gun pressed under his jaw. 8 months, Dustin said, low, shaking with something that wasn't fear. 8 months you let me believe I did this to myself. A car bomb. Bad luck, nobody's fault. You knew the whole time, didn't you? Rocco didn't answer, which was answer enough. Marcus and two others arrived seconds later, weapons up, and between them they had Rocco on his knees, zip-tied, bleeding from where the chair's frame had caught his cheek by the time the last of the noise in the house finally, truly went quiet. Mary sank down against the doorframe, hands shaking now that there was nothing left to hit, candlestick still gripped white-knuckled in one fist. Dustin wheeled back toward her, breathing hard, blood on his shirt that wasn't his this time, and looked at her the way he had that very first night, except there was nothing unimpressed in it now, nothing measuring, just something raw and grateful and terrified all at once. You good? He asked. Define good, she said, and let the candlestick finally drop from her hand, the sound of it hitting the floor the loudest thing left in the whole silent house. It happened almost an hour after the house had gone quiet again, after Rocco had been zip-tied into a car and driven off to wherever men like Marcus took men like him, after the last of the cleanup crew had swept the glass and plaster into neat piles and left. Mary was finally sitting, finally letting her hands stop shaking, when she heard the change in Dustin's breathing from across the room. Dustin. He didn't answer right away, and that was wrong. He was in his chair by the window, and his face had gone the color of ash, sweat beading along his hairline though the room was cool. His hand came up to his temple, slow and uncoordinated. Headache, he said, but the word came out slurred at the edges. Bad one. Mary was on her feet before she'd finished the thought that something was very wrong. She crossed the room and took his pulse without asking, and what she found made her stomach drop, his heart racing, far too fast, skin clammy and flushed above the collar in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with something failing underneath. Talk to me, she said, already reaching for the blood pressure cuff she kept in her bag out of habit. When did this start? Few minutes ago. It's nothing, it's just... He stopped, grimacing, one hand gripping the armrest hard enough that his knuckles went white. The cuff read numbers that made her blood run cold. His pressure spiked dangerously high, climbing even as she watched, a number that had no business existing in a body at rest. She knew this. She'd read the charts, ask the questions in his first week that he'd brushed off as unnecessary. Autonomic dysreflexia, a nervous system overreacting to something below the level of injury, something it couldn't feel and couldn't process properly, flooding his body with a response meant to protect him that would kill him instead if it went unchecked. Dustin, listen to me. This is serious. Your blood pressure's dangerously high, and it's climbing. I need you sitting up, not reclined. She was already moving the chair, adjusting him, her hands fast and certain even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Is there anything wrong below your injury level? Anything at all? A full bladder, tight clothing, anything pressing on skin you can't feel? I don't. He was struggling to focus now, his vision clearly swimming, and that scared her more than anything else had all night. I don't know, Mary, I can't. Okay, I've got it. She forced her voice into the same flat, steady register she'd used stitching his shoulder 3 weeks ago, the register that had gotten her through worse nights than this one in ICUs that didn't have anyone else coming to save her either. She checked the catheter first, found the line kinked where it had twisted during the fight, and corrected it fast, feeling the immediate, subtle change in his breathing as one trigger cleared. That's better, he managed, but his pressure was still too high, his face still wrong. I'm loosening your collar. She did it without waiting for permission, unbuttoning the top of his blood-stiffened shirt, checking his skin methodically for anything else that might be pressing where it shouldn't. She found a fold of fabric bunched under his hip from the fight, wedged in during the struggle with Rocco's men, and worked it free with hands that were shaking now despite everything she was telling them not to. Talk to me, she said, mostly to keep him present, keep his mind from sliding somewhere she couldn't follow. Tell me something. Anything. Mary. Talk to me, Dustin. The scholarship, he said, voice thin, eyes fighting to stay on her face. Bridgeport. I started it after my mother died. She used to say the neighborhood raised me as much as she did, and I never told anyone that. Not even Marcus. Keep going. She checked his pulse again, still fast, but the number on the cuff had stopped its climb, hovering instead of spiking. She kept talking low and steady, kept his hand in hers, kept watching the numbers the way she'd watch a patient's chart in the longest hour of a night shift. "There's a kid in that program," he said, words coming slower now but clearer, the panic in his eyes finally starting to ease as his body responded to what she'd fixed. "Reminds me of myself. Doesn't know I'm the one paying for it. I like that he doesn't know." "You're a soft touch pretending to be a hard man," Mary said, and heard her own voice crack on the edges despite herself. "I've known that since the night you told me about your mother's rug." The numbers kept easing, slow and steady, over the next 20 minutes, until finally the reading on the cuff dropped into something that looked like safety instead of catastrophe. Dustin's color came back in stages, his breathing evened out, and by the time the first gray light of morning found its way through the study windows, he was slumped, exhausted but stable, his hand still locked around hers where it had been for the better part of an hour. "You saved my life twice in one night," he said, voice hoarse, eyes barely open. "I had a vested interest," Mary said, brushing damp hair back from his forehead with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Turns out I'm fond of you. Very inconvenient, given the circumstances." He managed something close to a laugh, weak and real, and let his eyes finally close, safe enough now to rest, her hand still in his the whole way down into sleep. He waited until she'd slept, until the house had settled back into something resembling order, before he called her into the study. Mary found him at the desk this time, not turned away toward the window the way he'd been that first day, but facing the door, waiting for her, a slim black folder squared neatly in front of him like he'd been staring at it for a while, working up to something. "You look like a man about to fire someone," she said, sitting across from him in the chair she'd claimed as hers weeks ago without either of them commenting on it. "Opposite, actually." He slid the folder across the desk. "I want you to hear this before you see it." Inside was a transcript, dense with timestamps, and beneath it a small audio device he set on the desk between them and pressed play before she could ask. Rocco's voice came through, tinny and distant, recorded weeks ago through a wire Marcus had apparently planted after the ambush on 5th Street made his loyalty worth questioning out loud instead of just in private. He was talking to someone about a garage, a car that wasn't Dustin's, 2 pounds of C4, timed to a meeting Dustin was supposed to have walked out of and never walked out of the same. "Made him what he is now," Rocco's voice said, flat, almost proud. "Man can't lead from a chair forever. Just needed to speed up the inevitable." Mary sat very still through the rest of it, her hand finding Dustin's on the desk without either of them planning it. "8 months I told myself it was bad luck," Dustin said when the recording ended, his voice steady in a way that cost him something to keep steady. "A rival family, an accident, anything but someone standing at my own table smiling at me while he waited for the chance to finish what he'd started. I had this recording 3 days before the breach. I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" "Because once I told you, it was real. As long as it was just a theory I was chasing, I got to keep pretending I wasn't the kind of man who'd let something like that happen to himself twice." He looked down at their joined hands rather than at her. "I've spent 8 months treating my own body like a crime scene I refused to investigate properly, because investigating it meant admitting how much I'd trusted the wrong person for years, right up until the day he tried to kill me a second time." "You investigated it eventually," Mary said. "That's what matters. I investigated it because you made staying alive worth the trouble of caring how I got here." He finally looked up. "Rocco's dealt with. Permanently and quietly, in a way that won't come back on either of us. That part of this is finished. And the other part?" He reached into the drawer, the same drawer, she noted, that had once held a file on her life assembled before she'd ever walked through the gate, and pulled out a second folder, thinner, official-looking, a company seal stamped across the front that she recognized from the letterhead on his desk. Rossi Logistics. Except it wasn't Rossi anymore, she realized as she opened it. Somewhere in the paperwork he'd already started the process of folding her name into everything that mattered to him, legally, permanently. 15%, he said, of the legitimate side. Logistics, the real estate holdings, the scholarship fund, all of it. Equal say in how it's run, not a title that sounds important and means nothing. I had the lawyers draft it last week. I've just been too much of a coward to actually hand it to you until now." Mary stared at the papers, at her own name typed cleanly into language she didn't fully understand yet, but recognized the weight of. You're not doing this because you almost lost me twice in one night. I'm doing this because I already lost the version of myself that thought I could run any of this. The business, this house, my own life, without you standing next to me doing it. He said it plainly, none of the careful distance he used to wrap around statements like this. You told me once that you don't run from things because they're dangerous. You run when they're not worth staying for. I'm asking you to stay for this. Not as staff. Not as someone I'm protecting from a distance because it's easier for me. As an equal. In the business and everywhere else that matters. She was quiet for a long moment, looking between the papers and the man across from her. The same man who'd caught her wrist in panic the first day they met and let go the second he realized she wasn't going to flinch, who'd hidden a folder about her life out of fear rather than cruelty, who'd covered her body with his own twice now when it would have been easier, safer, smarter to let her go. I broke your favorite glass the first 90 seconds I knew you, she said finally. I know. And you hired me anyway. Best decision I ever made, even if it took me 2 months to admit it and one very bad gunfight to actually say out loud. Mary picked up the pen he'd set beside the papers, turned it once in her fingers, and signed her name where he showed her. Steady this time, no hesitation left in it at all. When she looked up, he was watching her the way he had that very first night after the glass shattered on the floor, except there was nothing guarded in it now, nothing measuring her for weakness. Just a man who'd finally stopped treating being seen like a threat, and a woman who'd finally stopped treating staying like a risk she couldn't afford. Partners, she said. Partners, he agreed, and reached for her hand across the desk, the same way he had that first storm-heavy night, except this time neither of them let go.